This video is sponsored by NordVPN. This is another great week for the European Union, as the EU signs a massive trade deal with India. They actually call it the mother of all deals, and this could even outshine the recent Mercosur deal that we signed a couple of weeks ago. And the timing of all of this is no coincidence, because originally a deal was not expected until the end of the year. But week after week, with Trump threatening more and more tariffs, the EU wants to reduce its dependencies, and is doing it with a lot of speed. And while we did have a massive hiccup last week, where Mercosur was sent to the European Court of Justice by the European Parliament, potentially delaying it by, years, the same is unlikely to happen with this deal. Because unlike Mercosur, European farmers are likely to be pretty happy with this deal. Why? We'll get into that in a moment. Because first, we have to look at what this deal is all about. And it's huge, not just economically, but above all, geopolitically, because it connects two heavyweights of the global economy. On the one side, the EU, 450 million people, and on the other, India, the world's most populous country, with 1.4 billion people and the fastest growing major economy on the planet. Put together, we're talking about a market of 2 billion people, accounting for around 25% of global GDP. Trading goods between the EU and India reached over 120 billion euros in 2024, and services at tens of billions more on top. And while that does sound like a lot, for two economies at that size, it's honestly very modest. And that's exactly what this very agreement is meant to change. Because at its core, this is about one thing: massive tariff cuts. Because right now, India imposes extremely high tariffs on European products. For example, cars up to 110%, machinery up to 44%, chemicals up to 22%, and wine and spirits up to 150%. Yes, 150. For a country like France, that's so brutal, because a bottle of French wine in India doesn't just cost you 20 euros anymore, it suddenly costs you 50. For most products, tariffs will be reduced to 0%. But in the case of wine and spirits, it will be between 20 and 30%. India would also immediately cut car tariffs to 40% for a limited number of internal combustion vehicles priced above 15,000 euros, and then gradually reduce them further, potentially down to 10%. And this reduction would apply to a quota of around 250,000 combustion engine vehicles per year. Electric vehicles, though, would likely be excluded in the first couple of years. Nonetheless, it's a massive jackpot for German car makers and other car makers around Europe. And there are so many other sectors that will also greatly benefit, as you can see on the list on the screen right now. And down below, you can find the link to the EU Commission webpage where it explains all of this in detail. And the market opens up in the other direction as well. India's access to the EU would be improved massively, as 90% of Indian goods will have no tariffs in the future. Textiles and clothing, footwear, pharmaceuticals, and IT and business services. So, unlike the Mercosur agreement, this deal is much less about agriculture and much more about industry and services. But this agreement isn't just about tariffs, because India is a services superpower. The deal also covers digital trade, cross-border services, and the temporary posting of skilled workers. This basically means that Indian IT specialists, engineers, and consultants can work a lot more easily with European firms and vice versa. For Europe, that's a bit of a mixed bag though, because more talent, more innovation, and lower costs also mean fears of outsourcing, wage pressure, and political backlash. And that brings us to the criticism of this deal. Unlike Mercosur, farmers weren't the main problem this time. Instead, the negotiations resolved around 5 core conflicts. First, you've got cars. For India, this is very sensitive, and that's because domestic manufacturers fear that they're going to be overwhelmed by European competitors. Then there's agriculture. But the interesting thing this time is that the resistance comes less from the EU and more from India. India protects millions of small-scale farmers through high tariffs and import restrictions, and the EU wants better access. For example, for dairy products, wine, and spirits. But for New Delhi, this is socially explosive, In India, agriculture isn't just an economic sector, it's a matter of survival. Third, we have labor and environmental standards. India has weaker labor protections than here in the EU. Yes, the agreement includes sustainability chapters. And yes, India will commit to climate targets. But as so often, enforcement is the real issue. Fourth, we have data sovereignty. The EU has the GDPR, but India has nothing of comparable strength. And fifth, often underestimated, investment protection. This was one of the biggest sticking points behind the scenes, as European companies want legal certainty for investments into India. The logic is simple though. If there's no trust, then there's no billion-euro investments. Nonetheless, even though there were all of these issues, a compromise was ultimately reached. Why? Because the strategic payoff is enormous. For Brussels, India is the most important long-term partner in Asia. And economically, studies estimate that India's exports to the EU could increase by 41%, while EU exports to India could rise by 65%. The biggest beneficiaries would be Germany, Netherlands, Italy, and yes, France as well. And as India is currently facing US tariffs of up to 50%, they would also massively benefit from this new deal. So what will happen next? The deal has been negotiated, but it's not done yet. Now the EU member states have to approve it in the Council, usually by a qualified majority. And in the end, it also needs the approval of the European Parliament. And that's exactly what turned into a last-minute obstacle with Mercosur just last week. So, you're probably wondering, are we heading for another Mercosur-style nail-biter? No, we really don't think so, because the risk is significantly lower than with the Mercosur deal. The broad center in the parliament, the EPP, Social Democrats, and Liberals, is fundamentally pro-India deal. And unlike Mercosur, there's no member state and no powerful agricultural lobby that has turned this agreement into a political red line. This is what I think. Just like Mercosur, I love these kind of trade deals because this allows us to differentiate from our trade with the US, China, and other countries across the world. The more of these trade deals that we have, the more resistant we are when one of these countries around the world starts acting tough with us with tariffs. Because if that happens, we just trade more with our other partners. And that is why this is so important. But, and this is a big but, because there is an elephant in the room. India is still buying large amounts of Russian oil, second only to China. And the uncomfortable question is pretty obvious. Should we lower tariffs for a country that is indirectly financing Russia's war effort? It's a real concern, and it does make me a little bit uneasy. But I think there's one key point here. Isolating India won't change their behavior, and engagement just might, because trade creates leverage, and partnerships hopefully create some kind of influence. And this agreement does give EU some soft power, it just won't have otherwise. And crucially, the trend is already shifting a bit. Russian crude oil imports into India fell to their lowest level in nearly 3 years in December last year. And in January this year, data suggests they're declining even further. And since the 21st of January this very year, there's actually also new EU sanctions on refined petroleum products that is entering into force. What this means is that any fuel refined in India using Russian oil can no longer enter the European market. And that move could reduce India's reliance on Russian crude even more, especially if the trade with Europe increases, which I hope it will. So, while this really does remain concerning, I do think we're better off building a relationship with India. And freezing this deal now, which will still take years to fully implement anyway, isn't the right move, I think. So, I do hope that the Council and the Parliament vote in favor, because I have been disappointed before, as you all know from my last video. Also, please do let me know what you think in the comments. Now, one of the other great ironies of the EU single market is this. On paper, you have free movement, but digitally, everything still changes the moment you cross a border. And I really noticed this year because I travel a lot for work, from Brussels to Strasbourg and even to conferences in Spain. And that's where our sponsor NordVPN comes in. Link in the description below. Because whether I'm editing scripts or answering emails from a cafe, hopping between trains or using hotel Wi-Fi, I know that my connection is encrypted and consistent, even on public networks. I just turn it on, and I don't even have to think about it. And in the evening, when things slow down, I can use NordVPN to keep accessing my paid online services from back home. So everything looks and works the way I'm used to when I'm traveling. If the single market is about reducing friction, NordVPN does the very same thing online. And you can get an exclusive NordVPN deal, plus 4 months extra by going to nordvpn.com/EUMadeSimple. And it's completely risk-free with NordVPN's 30-day money-back guarantee. So make sure you check them out. And thank you so much for watching. And thank you to our presidents. Ave Europa, Christian and Peter, Clement, Daniel, Dev, Eupedia, Giuseppe, HVDJ, Kiki, Loxen, Mashex, Mikael, Rashid, Shauki, Jan, Stefan, Unite Europe, and Westervang. See you in the next video.